In this very brief little video on the quadrilateral, I refer to a couple of videos that you might want to watch on YouTube. Actually, I recommend them highly. They'll help you to understand what I mean when I speak of natural law. They're by C.S. Lewis, and he calls this the law of human nature. So this is just a repeat of the slide that I had today in the PowerPoint when I introduced the quadrilateral. The next slide actually is where I'm going to explain it. It's taken from a longer video that I made for a medical ethics course where the students were about to work on papers on euthanasia, which we'll talk about in this course as well later on. At any rate, this is slightly different than the slide I had this morning because I've added this natural law piece to the quadrant of reason. And I've also suggested, as you know, in the previous slide, that you take a look at the videos by C.S. Lewis, which I'm going to post also on Moodle for you. They're short and really kind of fun to watch and really helpful in understanding this idea that there are some things that you can get pretty much universal agreement about that provide a kind of a deontological base. And that these function not as a revelatory source unless you want to use the idea that reason itself is kind of the revelatory source, in which case reason can put these ideas together, and we all do. We're trying to figure out what makes us flourish as human beings. This can be called natural law, or as C.S. Lewis calls it, the law of human nature. By the way, C.S. Lewis made these were radio talks that got turned into videos now on YouTube, but he is the guy that wrote the Narnia series, the children's books, which you may know. And these were short pieces that he did for the BBC during World War II to help try and explain the ethics of war in many ways to the people who were involved in it. So I mentioned this meta-ethical or worldview out of which your determination is going to flow with regard to how you're going to prioritize your principles in given situations. Where does a person's worldview come from, right? And again, why do they prioritize principles as they do when there's a conflict? So traditionally, this comes out of a religious tradition and a Christian religious tradition, Methodism actually. It's sometimes called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral from John Wesley. So it began with scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, all notions that were related to the Christian tradition. But you can broaden this out, and you can use the quadrilateral in a much broader context, right? You can think about this from the perspective of being a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, right? So what is the revelatory source for a given religion that becomes the ultimately important place where you get what's really true? What's morally true? How do I know what's morally true? Scripture or the revelatory source that's important. I should say, in many ways, I think you could argue that for the Enlightenment tradition, reason itself becomes the revelatory source. But that's another conversation. Nevertheless, I think we can think about the Enlightenment as a tradition in the way we think about Christianity as a tradition or Buddhism as a tradition. It has its own revelatory source. So you're going to have a tradition. Now, tradition doesn't mean any tradition, like every Christmas we put up Christmas trees or, well, maybe that is sort of related, but traditions, I don't know, at some colleges they throw their caps in the air. That's a tradition, right? But this kind of tradition, at least historically, when it was initially implied, it had to do with the church. What is the community that's developed around the revelatory source that holds that source as the most authoritative voice? And then the question is, the tradition is all the things that emerge out of that. So the communities gathered around this particular source. And in some ways, what they have to do, what we all have to do, is then make sense of our lives and of the situation we're in. And you try and interpret what you learn from your revelatory source and apply it to particular situations. right, that you're in. And a whole community that does this together. You're going to talk about this together. Some traditions do this from the top down. You've got theologians in the Catholic Church, for example, who pay a lot of attention to what does the church teach about what's true about God, and therefore, because this is what's true about God, we think that this is how we ought to act in the world. So truth moves from what's true about God to what's true about ethics, what's true about morality. And so this is where you're deriving, you're finding this, what's true here, what's morally true. And again, be careful not to just think of tradition as any old tradition. It's related, when you're thinking of the quadrilateral, it's related. It's the community that authorizes a particular source and then has a history of having interpreted that source in particular kinds of social situations. All right, so these first two, tradition and scripture, or tradition and reason, or the revelatory source and whatever that tradition is that's built around it, are going to be particularist. They're going to deal with particular communities. They're going to be different, right? Buddhists are going to make some decisions over here. Catholics are going to make decisions over here. I don't know. Different people are going to make different kinds of decisions from different traditions that are built around or derived from some revelatory source. So we're not going to get agreement necessarily across different traditions. The bottom two, theoretically, ought to be common. We ought to be able to share these. The notion here is that these are all things we can make sense of together as human beings, not as particularly a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever you are. The quadrant that's reason, that includes empirical data. That's a very important part of this, is where you take scientific evidence into account. This was very important in the church's debates around same-sex unions. And many religious traditions now have decided that the sexual orientation is not a moral issue. Now, they may decide that whether you act on that or not is a moral issue. But again, because of what we now know about how sexual orientation functions, where it comes from, we're not totally sure, but we know a lot more about it than we used to. This has changed. This has been brought in. So the tradition is now taking account of this in some places, not everywhere, but in many places, right? Another thing that fits in under reason is this whole discussion of natural law, or the law of nature. Remember the two videos we watched from C.S. Lewis, right? Remember that his argument, what he wanted to say was, if you watch people argue, it means that they must have some shared presuppositions about what counts as fair. Every time you say something's fair or not fair, you're making universal claims, right? And every time he wants to say, people start to get into arguments about, did you do this? Did you do that? Were you good? Were you bad? Are you guilty? People rarely will say, well, I just don't think that it matters. They'll say, I didn't do X. That's a very interesting thing, right? Something that C.S. Lewis has really spent a lot of time thinking about. But it suggests that we've got shared ideas here about what counts as good. We may then, remember Shantung compound, people can rationalize their decisions. We want to be good people, so we'll come up with all sorts of reasons why why it was fair for me to take 7 parcels, Red Cross parcels, and not give any to anybody else. But that was fair because I'm an American and they were for Americans, and however you're going to set this up. But lots of rationalizations to justify the fairness of my decision to do X or Y, based on the presupposition that good people do fair things, and fair things look kind of the same. That I'm not being selfish. I'm just going by the law here. The law says these are for Americans, and so they ought to go to Americans, even if the Americans get 7 and the Brits get none, right? So that kind of discussion, it all fits in under the reason quadrant. Natural law also is, we arrive often at decisions about what we should do, what we socially believe we ought to do, that we think that are really truly good decisions, because what we're really looking at is what makes us flourish. And so the presumption there is what makes us flourish as human beings or as a global community, those things are good because flourishing is presumably good. Now, you're not really getting down behind why is flourishing good? That would be the deeper question. But we can go a long way in society at coming up with moral agreements by making arguments with each other where we bring data in and we sort of say, well, look, if you remove children from the home at the age of 2 for this reason, or this reason, this reason, these are going to be the costs. And this is going to be terrible for this child. Or maybe it'll be better for this child because somebody else over here is going to say, well, no, we have an obligation to the children to take them away from their parents in some states. So you're going to get those kinds of debates going. But the very fact that we debate about this means that what we're saying is we all want to arrive at the best possible way of moving forward on some particular issue, such that it helps everything to flourish, right? We want to have flourishing happen. So those are the kinds of debates that go on. This requires observation and then some kind of rational analysis. Now, experience is its own kind of thing. Experience is related to the other three, right? When you look at whatever your revelatory source is, you're looking through some lenses here, the lens of my own experience. When I think about my tradition, when I reason about something, it's coming through me, right? So experience is always in play. But at least in the way we're using it in this class, normally what we'll think about is experience here, particularly as related to euthanasia, is going to have to do with things like, have you ever worked in a nursing home? And what did you see there? What kind of suffering did you observe? What did you hear from patients? Maybe you have a grandparent who died a slow and difficult death. But maybe this grandparent said, no, I'm going to wait for God's time. I'm not going to push things. I'm going to trust God. Now, that's an experience that can have a profound effect on children in the same family if they observe this, right? So those kinds of experiences are going to be specifically applicable, especially when you're thinking about, why do I think this or why do I think that? All right?